Hello and welcome to this presentation on the sacred and profane, how Catholics view technology and money. I understand this presentation will be starting, or close to starting, this conference on cryptocurrencies from a Catholic perspective. And I'm sort of setting the scene by talking about two main subjects. First, I want to talk about the big picture regarding Catholics, science and technology. And then I want to offer you a few general considerations about the morality of money. So hopefully with this background, this will help shape other discussions during the conference. So first of all, the big picture regarding Catholics, science and technology. And I should begin by introducing myself. I'm Father Andrew Pinsent. I work at the Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. I'm a former particle physicist with the Delphi experiment at the CERN laboratory in Geneva. Then I worked in business for 7 years. I trained as a priest, and now I'm back at the Faculty of Theology in Oxford. So I have a background in science, a background in philosophy, and a background in business as well. So let's begin by looking at the big picture regarding Catholics, science and technology. And first of all, I want to show you a picture. And most people recognize who this gentleman is. If I was live right now, I would ask you to name him, but I assume that you all know that this is Albert Einstein, famous for his theory of relativity. But far fewer people know who this is. And you can probably see his profession. He's wearing a wraparound clerical collar. But what is his relation to Albert Einstein? So there they are together at a conference, I think in 1931. As I said before, Albert Einstein is famous for the theory of relativity, but the other man in the picture is famous for another great scientific breakthrough. And if you don't know what this is, I'll show you on the next slide. He is Father Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, the father of the Big Bang theory. It's quite remarkable to me. I spent 6 years studying physics in Oxford. No one brought home to me that a priest invented the Big Bang theory, but that is the reality. It's Monsignor Lemaitre. He was a Belgian Catholic priest and astrophysicist, and he derived what became known as the Hubble-Lemaitre law in 1927, which is a theory about the expansion of the universe and how that expansion can be measured. It's interesting to see its reception. It wasn't called the Big Bang originally. They called it the blast of the giant atom. But one of its opponents named it in a radio program in England, and it became the Big Bang theory. And Father Lemaitre was honoured by the Church. He was made President of the Pontifical Academy of Science in 1936 and a Monsignor in 1960. As I said, I studied physics in Oxford for 6 years. No one brought home to me this remarkable development. By contrast, as late as 1948, astronomers in the Soviet Union were urged to oppose the Big Bang theory as promoting clericalism. So this theory was not popular for about 30 years in the Soviet Union. It wasn't until the 1960s it began to be dealt with and referenced in a favourable way. So that's Monsieur Lemaitre, originator of one of the most important theories of modern science. And let's look at a few other names that every intelligent Catholic ought to know about. So this is Father Giuseppe Piazzi, and a close-up picture of the object he discovered in 1801. And this is the minor planet or dwarf planet Ceres, which is between Mars and Jupiter. And no one knew there was anything between Mars and Jupiter until Father Piazzi discovered this object. It's a very small planet. It's about 1,000 kilometers in diameter, if I recall correctly. And the project to try to find this object was really the first pan-European scientific project, because all kinds of astronomers were working on this, but it's Father Piazzi who discovered it. We brought a spacecraft to Ceres in 2015. So let's look at a few other examples that every thoughtful Catholic, every thoughtful Christian ought to know about. So this is the father of modern genetics, Monsignor Gregor Mendel. And he was a priest, an Austrian Augustinian priest, and a monk. And he bred 29,000 pea plants, as one does. Imagine starting a project to breed 29,000 pea plants in his monastery garden. And pea plants were very useful for this kind of work, because you can measure their characteristics and how these characteristics were transmitted from one generation to the next. And Mendel gave us the laws of genetics. So this is the Isaac Newton of biology, giving us the first mathematical laws for genetics. And it's an extraordinary achievement. Thanks to Father Mendel's work, we're today able to feed the world, because we can adapt the genome for all kinds of crops, enabling crops to survive in very dry conditions or under attacks by parasites and so on. So genetics is extraordinarily important, probably the most important theory in modern biology. And it was another priest who discovered that. So here's a few other names to know about. Father Angelo Secchi, Father of Astrophysics. He was director of the Vatican Observatory. Yes, the Vatican has an observatory. And he was there for several decades. And he invented certain scientific instruments, the stellar spectroscope, the heliospectroscope, and these were both devices for analysing the light from the stars or the sun, to seeing what colours come out from the spectras. And the spectrum of a star can tell us all kinds of things. It can tell us what the star is made of. It can tell us how the star is moving towards us or away from us. It can tell us something about the temperature of the star. And so, thanks to this information, we began to study stars for the first time as physical systems. So this man put astronomy and physics together to create astrophysics. And there's a kind of star named after him, the Secchi variable, today. So let's look at a few other names. Father Nicholas Steno, Father Stratigraphy, one of the founding disciplines of geology. And he gave us all kinds of heuristics or rules of thumb for the natural history of rocks. So in the picture you see on the screen, you see in the lower picture three sets of mountains, or a set of three mountains, sorry, with deep valleys between the mountains, and you can see the same kinds of layers of rocks appearing in each of the three mountains. And the basic rule of thumb that Father Steno gave us is that the rocks were laid down before the valleys were gouged. So this kind of rule of thumb helped us to begin to interpret the natural history of rocks. So we've got quite a few eminent names. Let's add a few more. Father Boscovich, Father of Field Theory. Not much known in this country, or my country of England. Probably not much known in the United States either. But in Croatia, he's a big name. They put his face on banknotes, and there's also a crater on the moon named after him. What you see on the to one side of this slide is a model. It's the artistic representation of a model of mass modelled as particles in a field. This is a very 20th century concept. But this was from a book that Father Boscovich wrote in 1758. So it was very pioneering in terms of the development of modern field theory. And by a couple of steps, this may well have influenced the work of Einstein. So we've got Father of Field Theory. Let's look at a few others. Father of Crystallography. He became the pioneer of a scientific field by accident. He dropped a big crystal, I think someone had given him, and he saw all the fragments, and he began to measure the different lengths of the sides of the fragments of the shattered crystal, and he developed the law of crystallography. So this is the father of crystallography, and he also did all kinds of work with electricity crystals. So I'm wearing a very simple quartz watch, as many people do, and this is a direct descendant of the work of Father Hauy. The crystal in my watch vibrates very accurately with electric current going through it, and with that we're able to keep time very precisely. Father Haury's brother was Valentine Hauy, the founder of the first school for the blind. His most famous student was a man called Braille. So there will be another whole talk I could give about the faith and languages. I can't do that now, but I just leave that open as another whole field of culture influenced by persons of faith. Father Nicholas Callan, pioneer in electronics. I'm going to Ireland in a few days, and I'll be speaking at Father Callan's seminary, St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. And Father Callan had a laboratory there, which still exists today. I've seen it. It looks like something out of a Jules Verne science fiction book. Lots of old-fashioned valves and gauges, and something out of an old Doctor Who set, basically. It's in this laboratory, Father Nicholas developed something called the induction coil. The induction coils translate alternating current into direct current and vice versa. So incredibly important for all electronic devices today. Incredibly important also for power transmission, because electricity is transmitted to us through the use of alternating cable through power lines. Father Callan also invented the Maynooth battery in 1854, the most powerful battery in Europe. He didn't have a way of testing it mechanically, so he used to invite the students at the seminary to touch the live ends and see how big the shock was. And when the shock got sufficiently large, the rector stopped it, but that became the limit of the Maynooth battery. So a great pioneer. Father Callan saw the potential, by the way, of electronics to relieve domestic drudgery. I do meet quite a lot of young people today who say they can live without their cars, which is perhaps true in some of our big cities with good public transport. I've never met any young person today who says they can live without their washing machines. So Father Callan saw the value of electromagnetism in producing devices that would save a lot of domestic drudgery, and he was absolutely right in his prediction of what would happen. So a few other names. I'm always finding new ones. This is Father Casimir Zeglen, a priest working in the United States, in a very dangerous city. I'm afraid it's still dangerous today. It's Chicago. And Father Zeglen was a Polish priest living in Chicago, and he wondered whether something could be invented to protect the human body from bullets. The machine pistol was a bit like the atom bomb in the 19th century. Machine pistols, machine guns were very, very dangerous. People thought we could never have a war with these terrible weapons. But it was a big problem in Chicago, lots of guns, lots of crime. And Father Zeglen realized that silk could be used to stop bullets. And he created silk vests that could be quite effective as bulletproof vests. It saved the life of at least one monarch in Europe, Alfonso XIII. Sadly, the Archduke Ferdinand, whose assassination started World War I, the Archduke Ferdinand had one of Father Zeglen's vests, but he wasn't wearing it on the day of his assassination, so it was a bit sad. And as I said, Father Zeglen was a Catholic priest at the Polish Roman Catholic Church in Chicago, then the largest Polish church in the United States. So a few other names. Also a few other big inventions, of course, the printing press. Printing press is a product of Catholic Germany in the middle of the 15th century. Gutenberg's movable type printing press brought a lot of evolving technologies together in a practical way. And this is one of the most important inventions, perhaps the most important invention of the last 1,000 years. I've shown two pictures here. One is, I think it's from a museum in California, the International Printing Museum in California. And the other is a picture taken from New York, one of the public libraries, and it's a copy of one of the Gutenberg Bibles, which is his greatest work, Johannes Gutenberg's greatest work to print the Bible for the first time. So it was no longer written out by hand, but printed by machine. So a few other names and inventions. So I mentioned there the printing press. The modern equivalent will be digital humanities. Here in Oxford, we do a lot of work in digital humanities. This whole field is started by a Jesuit priest, Roberto Busa. And back in the 1940s, when computers had barely been invented, he saw the potential of using computers for work in the humanities. In particular, he saw the potential of using computers to digitize and interconnect the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian really of the last, well, since biblical times, and a man who wrote in a very, very structured way and enormous quantities of extremely well-structured work. So Father Roberto Busa saw the potential of computers. He began to plan a big digitization project of the works of Thomas Aquinas. IBM got interested, and IBM funded this work for 30 years. As a result of this, you can go online, Google Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, and you can get all the texts in multiple languages of the Summa Theologiae and many other works of Thomas Aquinas, thanks to Roberto Busa. And he really started the whole field of digital humanities. So all those figures I mentioned earlier have been men, but there are a few really important women as well. And this is very, very badly known, I'm sorry to say. The woman in this slide is called Maria Agnesi, and you're looking at the first professor of mathematics in human history. And Maria Agnesi was appointed by Pope Benedict XIV to the chair of mathematics and natural philosophy at Bologna. And she also wrote the first book discussing differential and integral calculus, a book that became important all over Europe. She was a devout Catholic. After the death of her father, she studied theology, care for the poor, homeless and sick, and eventually joined a religious order in Milan. To put her achievement in perspective, the first woman to get a PhD in maths in the United States was not till 1886. That was Winifred Merrill. That's nearly 150 years later. So Maria Agnesi is a real pioneer in terms of women in academic positions in mathematics. And there are other women also from the 18th century. On the left here is Laura Bassi, the first woman to earn a professorship in physics at a university in Europe, and the first woman in the world to earn a university chair in the scientific field of studies. One of her most important patrons was the future Pope Benedict XIV. On the right is Eleanor Piscopia, who in 1678 became the first woman in the world to receive a PhD degree, the first woman in history to receive a PhD degree, a Venetian Catholic. So, it's extraordinary. This, again, when I was at university at Oxford studying physics, no one ever told me these things. So hopefully, when you go away from this conference, you will have some general knowledge that may prove interesting in itself, but also useful in talking to others. So let's have a look at a few other things. So United States, you should be very conscious of the fact that the European exploration in the United States begins with Christopher Columbus. And I'm often asking people, what was Christopher Columbus afraid of when he sailed across the Atlantic? And normally they will repeat something which was also said by a recent United States president, and it's completely wrong. So people will often say Christopher Columbus was afraid of falling off the edge of the earth. This is completely wrong. He was trying to get to India, trying to get to the spices of the Far East, trying to find a route for Europeans to connect up with spices in the Far East. And he sailed west to get east. So clearly he believed the earth was round, but he was afraid of dying of thirst or hunger, trying to cross an ocean too big to cross. Fortunately, he bumped into what became the Americas in European knowledge, and that begins the story of the United States eventually. And there are other big names: Marco Polo, Prince Henry the Navigator, Bartholomew Diaz. Magellan's expedition was the first global circumnavigation. And all kinds of place names are testament to this history of exploration. San Francisco, obviously named after St. Francis of Assisi. Sao Paulo, named after St. Paul, and so on. And I found another one recently. This is the father of selenography. And you might wonder, what is selenography? And it's a study of the geography of the moon. And this is Father Battista Riccioli, Father Giovanni Battista Riccioli. And he gave us our modern system of lunar nomenclature. So when Apollo 11 touched down on the moon, it touched down in a place called the Sea of Tranquility. But the Sea of Tranquility had been named as such by Father Riccioli, who gave us the modern lunar nomenclature. So all those names and developments should be enough to scotch the myth that the church is anti-science, because if we're anti-science, we're not doing a very good job, having developed all these different fields and produced all these eminent people. But I want to, in the final part of this talk, to look briefly at the morality of money, as that's one of the main themes of this conference. So let's have a look at the general considerations for the morality of money. And the name of the sin of the misuse of money is avarice. And avarice has long been regarded as a spiritual danger. In fact, it contended with pride for a long time as the source and pattern of all evil. There's actually a biblical text on those, along those lines, 1 Timothy 6:10. But it's a puzzling sin, because there are hints, even in classical Christian texts, of a good kind of desire to have more, notably in the money-making and trading activities of certain persons in the parables of Christ, and in the evident utility of wealth for almsgiving. I want to give you an example. This is Saint Homogenes, who is the patron saint of business people. And he was canonized more or less by popular acclaim just shortly before St. Francis of Assisi. So St. Francis of Assisi was famous for having no money. St. Homogenes was famous for using money well. And as I said, he's the patron saint of business people, both canonized within a few years of their respective deaths. So at least some exemplars of heroic virtue have also had great wealth, and St. Homogenes will be one of them. And I want to look briefly or highlight what makes avarice bad. And there's a rather sad story. In 2008, just weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, a Walmart service worker called Mr. Damore died on Black Friday. I'm well aware in the United States you have this day of sales called Black Friday. And this Walmart service worker was crushed to death, trampled by a crowd of around 2,000 shoppers surging into his store for a sale. And this was terrible front page news in the United States. But a few people picked up a parallel because there's a very famous account of hell in Catholic culture called Dante's Inferno. And Dante's Inferno, at one point, portrays the avaricious, the sinners who have indulged in avarice. And these, the avaricious are smashing weights against one another for all eternity. It was just like the death of Mr. Damore in Walmart. And the other feature in Dante's poem is that all the avaricious souls have lost or obscured faces. And this is very significant because the face is like the window of the soul, and important means to communicate I to you. And I suggest that what makes avarice a sin is the explicit or implicit selling of this relationship for money or monetary value. Now, Dante's poem has been illustrated many times. In this illustration of the avaricious, you can see human beings really pushing these enormous weights around, which in this illustration they are sacks of coins. You can't see their faces directly, but you can see the weight of mundanity, of the weight of dealing with worldly things, and it's obscuring the I-thou relationship or the I-you relationship with other people. So what's the moral lesson? We may have to use money, perhaps even a lot of money, as part of our particular Christian calling, but we must be extremely careful not to sacrifice Christian love for money and not to be weighed down by monetary considerations, so we erase ourselves as being able to communicate with others. So instead of the avaricious who portray second-person relatedness, remember Christ's command: use money, tainted as it is, to win you friends, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal habitations. So this is the reversal of the sin of avarice. In the sin of avarice, one relinquishes, one sacrifices relationship to others, one crushes the faith of others. In the good use of money, one puts that money to work to win friends for eternity in heaven. So it's and that's very freeing because it puts things in the right perspective. It's also important to remember that God's resources are infinite and accessible for the work of salvation, like St. Paul using the ships and roads of the Roman Empire, or Gaudi's unfinished basilica. I mentioned Gaudi's basilica. This is a picture of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, detail the roof of the nave. This church, if you ever get a chance to go to this church, I do recommend it. It is spectacular. And it's still unfinished. It's been 100 years in construction since the death of Gaudi. But he was very relaxed. He said, my client is not in a hurry. And it's paid for not by the church, not by the state. It's paid for by visitors going to see it and paying to see the building. And so it's a self-financing construction. And it should be finished in a few years. No one knows how much it's going to cost altogether, but this is putting money to work for the glory of God and for the edification of the human soul, and that's really a wonderful thing. So a final thought, there's another reference to money in the Gospels, which I think is very significant, is when Jesus is asked for a tax. He's asked whether he pays a certain tax, and the request goes to Peter, the chief apostle, and Peter goes to Jesus, and Jesus gives him a very strange instruction. Go to the sea, cast a hook, take the first fish that comes up. When you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them, the tax collector, for me and for yourself. So it's almost like a jokey miracle, but I think the fact that it is like a jokey miracle is part of the point. The superficial lesson is that when working in God's service, one's needs will be met, but the eccentricity of the miracle also teaches an important lesson about the need to have a lightness of touch with respect to what can weigh us down. Because money can be a burden, and worry about money can be a burden. And this almost jokey miracle is really Jesus underlining we shouldn't be weighed down by this human invention. So conclusions. First of all, Catholicism has been the culture within which a vast range of sciences and technologies have developed. People don't realize that, but I've given you enough examples here to show, to illustrate the truth of that statement. I could also say a lot more about the faith's influence on philosophy or universities, but that's enough for now. So you've got plenty of counterexamples to the popular narrative. We don't need to fear new financial tools on a purely technological basis. So that's the first conclusion. The second conclusion, all evil uses of money, which is itself an invention, involve selling others in some way that's represented by the crushing of the face of the other. And money itself is somewhat tainted because it does distance people from one another, but it's not possible usually to write down precise moral rules regarding monetary quantities, We have many examples of holy beggars, and we've also got holy business people, holy monarchs. So a vast range of conditions in a monetary sense is compatible with salvation. The most important moral basis for the holy use of money is to win friends for the kingdom of heaven. We should combine prudence with a lightness of touch that acknowledges that money is at best a small good in light of eternity. Encourage liberality. So I'll finish off with a nice picture. There's one of my favourite paintings, the Van Eyck Mystic Lamb. And you can see in the background a representation of the wealth of nations. The wealth of nations often associated with Adam Smith, but it's a phrase that comes from the book of Revelation. And the idea of the good things of human creation being brought into the kingdom of heaven. And the final statement from the Apostle John, "Beloved, we are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Blessed are those called to the wedding feast of the Lamb of God. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. We're going to take, with Father, we're going to have a break in about 15 minutes, but we're going to do an interactive question and answer with you and your questions for Father. If you have questions, if you could come over here, and you guys are adults and you're energetic, so I have no doubt that your fertile brains have some questions. I'm going to start with one or two questions to not only because I think they're good questions to ask, Father, but to give you some time as well. So please be bold. In fact, if I need to do like I used to do with my youth group, I used to have candy, and I used to say whoever comes up with a question gets the candy, but I'll think of some other gift for the first 2 or 3 people who come up and ask a question. We have really great opportunity. One thing I'm not sure if Carl mentioned, I'm not sure if he knew of this, but Father worked for a number of years, I think 6 years perhaps, as a scientist at CERN, C-E-R-N, in Switzerland, splitting atoms prior to becoming a priest. I think that was the chronology, but I could have gotten that wrong. So, Father, while these nice people are lining up with their questions, I want to ask you 1 or 2 questions. Father, I've been enamored for years with the reason why we Catholics are comfortable with bingo, booze, dancing, technology, and all created matter is because we believe and affirm the incarnation, the idea that God became man. That's such a mind-blowing concept. So can you comment, is it a correct thought that the incarnation, God becoming man, sort of becomes an affirmation of the created world?
Yes, that's one reason why I finished my talk with a beautiful painting. And there's another whole story there about the church being one of the founding bases for Western art. Between at least the years 500 and 1500 AD, all art was representing the concretely given supernatural, the incarnation, and things connected with the incarnation. And we Catholics have got our hands dirty for a long time with experiment. The ancient Greeks didn't have experimental method. The High Middle Ages, at Oxford, they began to invent experimental methods, trying to work out the causes of things. So, yes, I agree totally that a lot of all these developments can be traced back to the incarnation, one way or another, the concretely given supernatural. And what we don't have is a faith that believes in the disembodied spiritual. It's the embodied and redeemed spiritual. It's a bit like a garden rather than a machine. I think that organic metaphor is what we think about a lot in our businesses, in our families, in our universities. Where universities go wrong, by the way, is when they turn into machines for generating qualifications. Universities at their best are more like gardens for encouraging ideas.
So a corollary to that, as if you will, a couple more people maybe come up, a corollary to that, and I don't say this as a swipe, I say this so we can juxtapose it against the Catholic position. From what I think I understand, the maybe traditional Protestant view was a kind of rupturing of body and spirit that created a false, a non-correct dualism, that somehow the material world is bad. Can you maybe comment on that and maybe connect it to America, how America had perhaps these Calvinist underpinnings that made us very productive, but that could easily lead to an inhuman approach to work and other things. So can you comment on maybe how Catholicism's integration of body and spirit as compared to maybe a rupturing of those, of maybe other Christian perspectives?
You've asked a difficult question for me to address to an American audience. I want to begin by saying that I love the United States of America. And I want to also say thank the United States of America, as I often do when I meet Americans, because you saved the world at least twice in the last 100 years. Thank you very much for that. My grandfather fought with the Americans at D-Day, so grateful for the help. I think that there is some truth in the underpinnings of American life. It's interesting, the most interesting American cities. What's the one on the estuary of the Mississippi? Can't remember the name. The famous American city on
New Orleans. New Orleans.
New Orleans. And New Orleans is a very culturally rich place to go, but it's actually a very Catholic part of the United States. The slight danger of the philosophies of the United States is that they tend to be very productive, but not very beautiful. And a lot of American cities look very similar to one another. But it's not a matter of lack of efficiency, but there is a kind of plainness or what's missing is a sense of the sacramental. And as Catholics in the United States, it is good to bring back the sacramental as much as possible. And I see it all over the United States in a small way. So I used to work in St. Louis, Missouri for a while, and the Italian-American community has a really beautiful church. Every young married couple in St. Louis wants to get married in that church. It's so beautiful. But the Italian immigrants brought that from Italy, the whole design for the church and everything. So there's something a little bit lacking in American culture, but where Catholics can help, and should try to do so.
So we have a series of questions, and everyone, we have about 13 minutes, so maybe a succinct question, and Father, a succinct answer, which you've actually been doing. Thank you for that.
So Jesus had the parable of the talents, which I think is kind of relevant to a conference that's discussing a lot of finance and that sort of thing. And so one thing that's really confused me about Catholic teaching is the issue of usury. And so it's not clear to me what it is. And it appears to me that like the church teaching on this even changed. Like somewhere along the line, it went from being a very serious sin to the whole entire world is basically based on something that looks like usury. But the parable of the talents seems to be sort of okay with interest. And so can you elaborate on what is going on here? I'm kind of confused.
That's a wonderful question to begin with, and you're right. It's a problematic issue, usury. Look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, the old Catholic Encyclopedia, which has all been digitized, it's all online, and the article says that the church has, if you read through the last 2,000 years, there's a huge spectrum of views about usury. And the reason there's a confusion here is because money is an invention. And so it's hard to bring out natural moral laws for money alone. It's an invention, it's a very useful invention, but its function changes over time. So in an inflationary society, it's very hard to do without some interest when you lend money, for example. And that's why in my talk, I didn't offer you precise rules for the use of money. I gave you St. Homogeneous as well as St. Francis of Assisi, because you can use money well. But what you've got to be careful of is anything which crushes the face of the other. So, if you dissipate your wealth by not asking for interest when you should, then that's like crushing yourself. On the other hand, if you have ruinous rates of interest which crush others, then again you violated the rule of charity. But what I would say, although it's hard, I do meet American business people who are quite saintly, and they use money professionally at a very high level. But they have a lightness of touch. They're not possessed by possessions. I think that's the golden rule.
Great question, succinctly asked. Great answer, succinctly given. Questions?
Hi. Thank you for answering that last question, and I think it probably answers mine. I know the church teaches about how we are to use money. Does it have anything about the definition of money, about the debasing of a currency? I think you answered it just now, but I'm wondering if it teaches about what is the definition of a sound, moral money.
I don't want to go into too much detail on this, and in fact, it's not my field of expertise, so I'm sorry, I can't say very much. But if you read Dante's Inferno, there is the second deepest pit of hell, and the very deepest part of the deepest pit includes people who debase currency. So that's how serious currency debasement has been regarded.
Let's tweet that one out. I know we're tweeting certain phrases out, but that's a biggie. I'm sorry, Father, go ahead.
It's a group called the Malborge, the second most deepest part of hell. And debasing currency ruins everything. And I've seen places in the world where corruption, and this is a kind of corruption in government, causes all of society to break down. And it's like cancer in society. And I think that's how debased currencies can feel in many parts of the world. You're lucky in the United States because you have the reserve currency of the world, so you can print away. But there is a price we pay, and we should all be careful. I'm speaking to you as a country which is also deeply in debt, and where politicians are very tempted to print money.
Thank you. Dave.
Good afternoon, Father. Thank you very much for pointing out all the pioneers in Catholic technology over the centuries. It's great. In the early 80s, I read a book it was called Silicon Snake Oil, and it talked about all the potential negative outcomes that would come from the internet. At the same time, I read another book, I don't remember the name, that talked about the great things that could come from the internet. And I wanted to get your opinion on how we make sure the good side wins instead of the evil side. How do we put the controls in place to make sure that we're putting these things to the good applications? Thank you.
What another fantastic question. Thank you so much. Well, one general comment about the internet is that this technology aligns quite well with Catholicism in certain ways. One of which is, as Matthew pointed out earlier, is connected with the incarnation, because the communication and expression of the faith ought to be multimedia. It ought to be more than just words. One of the downsides of the printing press was that pictures became relatively more expensive than text, far, far more expensive than text. But today, thanks to internet-based technologies, pictures are about the same price as text, and printing out a picture can be the same as text. And so this is a tremendous opportunity, particularly as our church is full of fantastic art, and the history of our church is full of art and music. There's a whole other story there. So multimedia technologies can be beautiful and effective at presenting things connected with the faith. And the other big issue is the interconnectivity of information. Now, as Matthew was saying earlier, I used to work at CERN in Geneva, and when I was there, a group at CERN invented something which changed all our lives, which is the World Wide Web. And it began by people connecting physics documents together, and suddenly it spread everywhere. And although I don't know if he denies it today, but I remember Bill Gates saying the internet will never be important. And initially he believed it. Later he was trying to slow everyone else down, as he was desperately trying to get back in the game. But the internet was a big surprise when it came along. And the connectivity of information, that's very valuable. That's why I quoted the Jesuit priest who arranged all the works of Thomas Aquinas to be digitized. And this is again where the United States has done a good job. There's a philosophy in the United States, a business. I don't want it perfect, I want it Thursday, right? And rather than wait, in Europe we tend to be more conservative. We try to wait till we get everything right and then do something. America just has a go. But there's sometimes that works well. And back in the 1990s, someone gave me a CD produced in California, and the CD had all the works of the ancient church, the first 600 years of Christianity, all the works connected together, produced on a single CD for $40. And I was staggered by this, staggered. And so I think, so certainly it can be used well. Its good use is maybe flooded out by bad stuff. I've got no easy answer to that, except produce the good stuff, avoid the bad stuff. Be careful of evil images. I would say that to anyone, because the brain does not have a delete button. But you can also fill it with good and wholesome things, and the internet can help with that.
Very good. So we have 4 minutes left in good American style. I want to keep us tight. So Giovanni, if you could ask your question, and then Father, a succinct answer, and then a few closing words, and then we will take a break.
Hi, Father. So my question is, I work in the pro-life movement, and it was interesting that you brought up so many, Catholic scientists, and I think, I'm curious to hear your position on how the church has effectively communicated the scientific fact of human life beginning at conception, and basically maybe if you've done any research on that, or how would you say we as a church can maybe improve our communication when it comes to that?
Yes, I think there are things we can do, but I have to also say that human beings today do not listen to arguments very much. So I have to warn you, you can have the most fantastic arguments in the world, that won't necessarily get a point across. There's a kind of growing intellectual insanity in our societies. But the pro-life movement, I think what needs to be communicated is a sense of the sanctity of life. And here there's a story to be told. In my country, I'm not sure in the United States, but in my country, we still call nurses sister, which seems right a bit odd. Why do we call nurses sister? And we call nurses sister because nursing started with religious orders. And these used to be nuns caring for the sick. And that act of caring for the sick is very highly valued. And this is where we communicate a sense of the sanctity of life. So, yes, there are things we can say about, there are arguments we can give. And I think one thing about the pro-life argument is the fertilized embryo starts acting to protect itself after fertilization, and that's an immediate action. So it's already acting as a self-perfecting being, even as soon as the sperm enters the egg. So there are things we can say about that intellectually, but I think what we mostly communicate is a sense of the sanctity of life. And here our witness is the best thing we can give.
Great question, Father. Great answer. Everyone, please, let's give Father our thanks.